As you know, in this series which we presented this month, we wanted to give you a good overview of the great, outstanding mystics of the Christian tradition, both male and female, and we conclude this evening with one of the most unusual and to some people at one time most controversial of the mystics of the Western tradition, the one who was known in German as Meister Eckhart. Now, a little bit of an explanation for you in other terms. I was at one time engaged, and I still have the manuscripts, on writing probably a small book on the great mystics. And so I have my notes, which served lecture purpose earlier too, and these are all written out like essays. And therefore I may be, at least from time to time, somewhat departing from my usual custom of a more extemporaneous presentation, because I have all this material, and while I have it in front of me, it weighs on my shoulder that I should bring it forth. So you'll have to be patient with me in that respect, and don't think that I have departed from my usual lecturing format, but it is because of previous work. Now, unlike some of the other German mystics of the Rhineland, some of whom we have already reviewed, Meister Eckhart, as he was called, possesses not only the distinction of being the most prominent mystic of his period, but also he may be considered by us a broader heretic, which makes him a little more, makes our relationship to him a little more cozy, so to say. At the very end of his life, he was tried for heresy. This was in 1326 in Cologne, otherwise known as Köln, but unlike so many others, he was not burnt or even imprisoned, but he was released, even though he was not quite cleared of the charge. In the following year, he traveled to Avignon, where at that time the popes were ensconced, to be examined by a papal commission. 2 years later, a papal bull, and the papal bull is not a dairy animal. You know, it's actually something else. A papal bull condemned as either heretical or at least dangerous 28 articles of his propositions drawn from his works. By this time, however, Eckhart was dead, having died somewhat late in 1328 or early 1329. The papal document also alleged that prior to his death, which would have been an opportune time to do so, that prior to his death, he recanted his heretical or suspect teachings. He professed that he professed the Catholic faith, as if he hadn't confessed it before. But of this there is no real proof. Eckhart's influence both in his time and in later periods of history was considerable. Among his contemporaries, or almost contemporaries, he had many illustrious followers. And they are worth mentioning because, God willing, and they'll still be occupying this not always very comfortable chair in which I am sitting, we might get around to discussing some of these other people as well. So we need to keep that in mind. His influence was considerable. For instance, others about whom it would be worthwhile to have some discussions, Heinrich Suso and Johannes Tauler, and the noted Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century. These were all great students and followers of Meister Eckhart. I even knew a very pleasant old lady, who was convinced that she was a reincarnation of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. And I never discouraged her. I said, well, you know, who knows, maybe. In any event, she was still fond of Meister Eckhart, so that says something. So then, and clear down to the 19th century, the German idealistic philosophers were all indebted to Meister Eckhart, his influence being particularly strong on Hegel, on Spinoza, and on my old favorite Schopenhauer. Even the German language is indebted to Meister Eckhart, for he wrote many of his most mystical works in medieval German instead of in Latin, which would have been the academic custom at that time. And so he proved that complex religious ideas could be expressed in the German tongue, even as Schiller and Goethe primarily with their dramas had proven that Enlightenment era German was a good way to convey human life and human emotion, and that created, of course, the fabulous dramas of Schiller and of Goethe, and subsequently really created the uniform German language from the so-called Bühnendeutsch, the German of the stage German, and that then eventually filtered down. And while there are still, as we call it in German, Mundarten, dialects in the various German regions, there is a very, very fine language, the literary German language, which I adore, and somehow in my dotage it creeps back on me. And I think more in German than I think in English, which is kind of curious because I only lived in a German-speaking country for 6 years, and I've been here, maybe 60 by now. In any event, so such people are very influential, even in a cultural and in a linguistic sense. The recognition of the suitability of the German tongue for these recondite and mystical subjects was later utilized by Martin Luther and his fellow reformers, among others. I'm sure for that the Catholic Church was not very grateful either. Eckhart was the most distinctly German of the German mystics, for which reason he was extolled by German patriots ever after. Now, his complete name was Johannes Eckhart, and he was born in the village of Hochheim near Gotha in 1260. His father was a steward in the castle of a local nobleman, and in the course of his childhood, Eckhart became imbued with the concepts of chivalry and indeed of nobility, which he came to utilize in a spiritual sense in the course of his career as a mystic, and which we shall discuss in a few minutes. In fact, I think we might as well plunge into it right now. Eckhart, like all educated people of his time, was very fond of classical Greek culture, knew very good Greek, and read the classics and studied them with great interest. He became familiar there with the Greek concept of Aristos, which means the best, from which the term aristocracy is derived. He felt that some people stand out from the crowd because they are better, and that a division of humanity into the better and the lesser is part of a natural order, which will not be denied, I think, by people of some profound thought, but certainly would be violently denied by some people in our culture today. But when you become familiar with Eckhart's way of dealing with this matter, you might find certain aspects that previously have not occurred to you. His favorite word in this regard was edel, which the translation of which is noble, but which usage denotes someone of rank. Now, the concept was amplified by Eckhart to be applied in a spiritual sense. Here I'll take a little side road, as I often do, and as is generally considered at least permissible for aged persons, and that is to reminisce, you know. I'm in the reminiscing stage of life. So here is my reminiscence on this subject. Soon after I came to this country, I ended up in a rinky-dink little college in the Californian Siberia, which is called the San Joaquin Valley, a period of my life of the memories of which I don't cherish. But let us say, in this rural institution, I met one professor who was really a fabulous individual. His name was Dr. Vincent Evans, and I will always pay tribute to him, because somehow he was the one with whom I could interact in a very creative manner. And you know what he did to me to begin with? He wanted me to write a paper to serve as my entry to his philosophy class. And I said, you know, Professor, my English is not good enough. Well, what other language do you speak? And somehow I just hit on it. I should have said German, but I said French. He said, write a paper in French. So my entry essay in an American academic institution, no matter how little, was written in French. And he gave the title to it for me. He said, how do I know that I don't know? Not an easy topic, I would say. In any event, in it, I, even though I was about 21 going on 22 years old, I thought I'll act a little bit like a smart aleck. And so among other things I wrote in the essay, I wrote it in French, of course, saying that I understand that it's in the American official documents, in the American Constitution, that all men are created equal. I said, my position on that is that they may have indeed been created that way at the time of creation, but that somehow at the present time they seem to be singularly unequal to each other. And Dr. Evans did not take exception to it, but rather wrote almost a little essay of his own to me, also in French. And therein he was very insistent on the fact that, you have to know your history. And your history, when you know your history, then you will see that this particular phrase was stimulated or decreed by the founding fathers for a purely legal reason, because in the British law of the time, if you were a peer of the realm, you could also be tried by your peers. We still have that expression, your peers, and they could not be tried by a regular tribunal. And so Washington and Franklin and Madison and the rest of them felt that that was unnecessary under the circumstances, and that all people should be tried as equal. But he said this only means that they're equal before the law. It doesn't mean that they're equal in intelligence. It doesn't mean that they are equal in the grandeur of the vision of their soul. It doesn't even indicate that they are of equal character, good or bad. It does not pertain to that. That's an entirely different issue. Well, I thought apparently I have hit on a man who has the ability to agree with me, and those are the kind of people I like, even at that time. So let's say, taking this a little bit further, it must be kept in mind that, let's say, metaphysical and theological concepts of equality at the level of the soul or at the level of the spirit should not be interpreted in a literal fashion in ordinary society, that they pertain to something else. And that this factor, I think, in certain ways, was present in the work of Eckhart. Eckhart wrote, and these are almost direct quotations from partial quotations from his work. Eckhart said that the true noblemen and noble women are noble women and noble men of God, and that God honors them accordingly, says Eckhart. And these persons are not merely noble in bloodline, which is of course the medieval social order and worldly status, but they are, and these are his very words in German, the knowers of God, who are ennobled by their knowledge. Now this brings to mind sort of related phenomena. For instance, I read in some fairly authoritative literature that it is a quite common custom in some of the Sufi orders in India, in the Middle East, and so forth, for the initiated brothers of the local Sufi, well, we could call it lodge, if we are not becoming too Western with it, they would greet each other smiling on the street. Your Majesty, Your Excellency, with all kinds of exalted titles. And if somebody took exception to that, he said, well, we are honoring the spiritual greatness of our Sufi brothers. You see, so that, let's say, the metaphor, if such it is, of royalty and of nobility applied in a spiritual fashion is not merely an invention of Meister Eckhart, but it is, I think, a worldwide psycho-spiritual phenomenon. So that is, I think, of some interest. So Eckhart said that these persons are not merely noble in bloodline, but they are the knowers of God who are ennobled by their knowledge. Now here we may note a keynote that has affinities to Gnostic wisdom, of course, and holds a significant paradox. The Gnostics and their spiritual kith and kin have always held that all human beings contain a spark of the highest Godhead, and thus in their spiritual nature they are equal. So equality thus in a transcendental sense is most assuredly a Gnostic teaching. By the same token, it is also certain that Gnostic wisdom recognizes that as to their present condition, people are very different from each other, and that these differences are not only skin deep, but they extend to their souls. We know that the ancient Gnostics had proclaimed, because it's in all appears in the literature, that they proclaimed three soul types, as we might call them. And that these three soul types are very different from each other, and their differences are quite important. So the soul types spoken of by the Gnostics are the Heletic. These are Greek words transmogrified into English, the Heletic, the Psychic, and the Pneumatic. And that often the Pneumatics, which is the most refined, the highest category, the people of the spirit, are true Aristoi, namely the best. That is the Greek word. The nobles of God's royal court. So this combination of egalitarianism and aristocracy represents a paradox which is peculiar to certain forms of higher mysticism, and which was certainly present among the Gnostics, and which was greatly extolled by Meister Eckhart. So the resolution of the paradox may be found. And I will save you the trouble to rack your brains about it too much, and I'll try to indicate it to you how it may be formulated. Human beings are equal in potential, but unequal in the degree of the realization of their potential. I would say that when that is thought through, it's an argument that is really irrefutable. But of course, people can try to refute anything. So that is really the resolution of the paradox. In the New Testament, as well as in the Gospel of Thomas, which is a sort of I mean, the Gospel of Thomas has been described in various ways, but it's almost a digest of the disclosures of the sayings and the more authentic ones of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, as if somebody had picked out all all his really interesting sayings and put them all together in the Gospel of Thomas. So they are of considerable authority in various ways. So what we have here then is, let's say that let me step back a little bit and try to explain the three Gnostic soul types. We have first of all the spiritual or pneumatic, as the Greek word has it, which represents the highest attainment, the highest achievement of the human psyche in spiritual terms. And then we have the psychic, by which is not meant somebody who lays out the tarot cards or looks at your palm or anything of that sort, but one whose consciousness is, let's say, the psycho-spiritual point of gravity is located not in the spirit any longer, but in the psyche, in what we would nowadays call the four functions of the personality: physical, emotional, mental, and intuitive. And so those are when the consciousness is primarily focused on these functions, then you have what the old Gnostics called a psychic. And then, of course, there is the highest, let's say the pneumatic is the spiritual and psychic, and then there is the lowly hyletic. Hyle means matter, and here we have the person who is extroverted and whose consciousness is, let's say, primarily focused on physical reality. So I would say Western culture in its educational and other intellectual functions, at least since the late 18th century, first only in an elite form and later on more popularly, has become hyletic. Hyleticism is the same as materialism. And it is because of the coming of that materialism which proceeded, you might say, from the top down, from the intellectual and the learned class, and from there filtered down to other strata of society, that we find an appearance of materialism which has never gone away, and which primarily was an intellectual preoccupation of a philosophical nature, really, influenced by what passed for science at various historical periods, but which ultimately penetrated all kinds of other areas of endeavor. And most unfortunately to my mind, and I am just one mind, most unfortunately to my mind, it penetrated eventually politics. And it penetrated politics by way of the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. So when we come to that, we see that Heleticism, as the old Gnostics would call it, has penetrated the culture, and far from going away, it is still around. Of course, like all intellectual preoccupations and allegiances, it changes some of its external expressions from time to time. But when you analyze the reality behind these expressions, you find that they are always the same. And that is, let's say, the least desirable category of a soul type according to the old Gnostics, and it would seem that in his own way, as the result of his own gnosis, of course, Mestre Eckhart pretty much agreed with that. Those who have not cultivated, so says Eckhart, not cultivated their God-related potential, we might as well say divine potential, remain spiritual paupers, as he called it, spiritually impoverished, while those who have inadequately cultivated them become mentally active but spiritually inert, which would be the Gnostic definition of the category of the psychic. And only those who have brought their spirit to full flowering may be considered the Aristoi, the best, which to the Gnostic would be the pneumatic. Eckhart's vision disclosed to him this most valuable truth. And so Eckhart was no slouch in intellectual terms either. He was a man of considerable philosophical and theological training. So when he was working with these concepts, the ultimate justification of which resided in his mind as the result of his own spiritual experiences, he was, to use a vulgar regional expression of our own country, he wasn't whistling Dixie. Just to kind of indicate a little bit his credentials, at the age of 15, he entered, which at that time was sort of in every age, and this is not of very great importance except historically, there was another monastic order that was the fashionable monastic order. The first monastic order was fashionable because there was no other monastic order, were the Benedictines, with Saint Benedict of Nursia, who founded his famous monastery in the Apennine Mountains in Italy. And if you are very interested in those things, you may go there still and view them. And then there came others. Well, at his time, the Dominican order was the fashionable order. And you might say, oh dear, but the Dominican order was the one that managed the Inquisition. So how could somebody like Mestre Eckhart or Giordano Bruno, for instance, these really very esoteric people, how could they function in the Dominican order? Well, we got to remember that after he joined the Dominican order in Erfurt, where he studied for about a decade prior to his ordination to the priesthood. And now you better perk up your ears, but now he attended the School of High Studies in Cologne, in Köln, as we call it in German. This was the school that was founded by Saint Albertus Magnus, also known as Saint Albert the Great, who was himself a Dominican before he became an archbishop, and who is to this day, let us say, the patron saint of magicians and of alchemists. And he was also deeply influenced by the very famous student of Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, who became the father of Western theology, and who himself had the reputation of an alchemist and a magician. And there are all kinds of really nice stories about St. Thomas Aquinas, other than that he became quite corpulent in mature age. My doctor friend says that when you get old, one or two things will happen to you. Either you expand or you shrink. Well, I shrunk. So I have problems keeping my clothes falling off of me. But let us say St. Thomas, the holy Count of Roccasecca, because he was from an Italian noble family, that St. Thomas expanded. And they still showed one time when I was moseying around in north of Rome, long time ago, there was a monastery there where presumably St. Thomas Aquinas lived toward the end of his life. And they have a big refectory table, a big, thick wooden table. And in that refectory table there is a cutout at a certain point, and they say, that's where St. Thomas Aquinas sat, and they had to cut out the table to accommodate him. And they show that with considerable pride. No concern about obesity around there. In any event, Thomas Aquinas was, of course, a disciple of Albertus Magnus. Albertus Magnus was known as the greatest magician and the greatest alchemist of his time. There are even now, in even some pretty cheap establishments, sleazy bookstores and things like that, they will have grimoires allegedly authored by Albertus Magnus. But in any event, he was a very learned and very skilled occultist, shall we say. And certainly St. Thomas learned a great deal from him as well. Now, how about the high mysticism as represented by Mestre Eckhart? Where did that come from? Well, obviously some of the impulse and some of the training also came to him from St. Thomas Aquinas. Because, Thomas Aquinas wrote the normative work of what then became known as scholastic theology, and really made the switch from a Platonic to an Aristotelian orientation in Christian theology. Now you might say that wasn't a very big improvement. Well, maybe it wasn't. But let's say he was ordered to do that under holy obedience. All right, Brother Thomas, you'll write the definitive treatise on theology, okay? And that will become the theology for the whole Western Church. All right, Your Holiness, and so he went ahead and did it. But while he did a very good job, although I must say to try to study St. Thomas and his interpreters directly, whether in the original Latin or otherwise, is a real chore. I had to do it, and it wasn't very pleasant. Very Aristotelian, very intellectual. I was just trying to prove the divine mysteries by way of intellectual intricacies, which only goes so far. But anyway, that was the work of St. Thomas. Now, St. Thomas got older, and then all of a sudden he changed. And there's a lot of documentation of that. He was up in the pulpit giving a sermon, for instance, and in front of him were pages of his own book, of the Summa Theologica, and he tore it up and threw it down to the people. He said, "People, this is so much straw." And then people asked him later on, "Well, Brother Thomas, how can you say that? You did so much work on that and you have such great distinction." And he said, I can say it because now I know something else. I know better. And so he was, particularly during that period of life, and that this is not really supposed to be a lecture about Thomas Aquinas, but since he was a very influential teacher of Mestre Eckhart, I think it is in order that he had acquired a high mystical vision, and so he could see that all the intellectual statements about God and about divine things are extremely inadequate, and that therefore he named them being so much straw. So then he devoted his what was left of his life to a great extent to what? To poetry, to spiritual poetry. And he wrote the most beautiful Latin hymns, which are of a very great mystical content, and which have survived, especially among those who value that sort of thing. For instance, the hymn that is sung every time when the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament takes place, the Tantum Ergo Sacramento, is by St. Thomas. And it is within the context of a yet larger poem. And there are a whole number of beautiful, exalted, mystical poetry to which he devoted pretty much the literary activities of the latter part of his life. Now, you also need to remember when the legendary about Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas and so is around, that it wasn't at all unusual, let us say at that time, for churchmen of prominence and at times of very great learning and mystical attainment, like Mestre Eckhart, to be also interested in magic, because that they felt that was the external application of the mystical principle. I think it's attributed to Albertus Magnus, who is a saint and a doctor of the church too, as is St. Thomas, that sometimes he said, "The Lord God is a magician. Otherwise, how could he have created this world or anything else?" So in other words, the application of spiritual principles in external manifestation, they considered magic. And I always feel a certain pride, unjustified in my case, that the ecclesiastical founder of my native country, of Hungary, Pope Sylvester II, who sent the Holy Crown, which is still revered in Hungary, you can see it in the Houses of Parliament, and started the now more than 1,000-year-old Hungarian nation and the Hungarian kingdom. Pope Sylvester II went down in history as the greatest magician pope. His original name was Gerbert, and he was a French Benedictine monk who went to study the sciences, and magic was considered a science, in Spain with the Muslim magicians, and who then became Pope. In any event, these things were about and around, and you might say applied spirituality was often regarded as magic because it involved phenomena that were different from ordinary experience. So then these were some of these worked into the background of Meister Eckhart. Somewhere near the year 1300, Eckhart attained a prominent position in the Dominican order as the prior of Erfurt and the vicar of the state of Thuringia. Unlike others, however, Eckhart did not use his philosophical and theological learning to construct a system of thought, as we might say Aquinas did. No, that's not what he did. But to understand the reality of God and to teach the need for humans to be, as he called it, deiformis, which is a Latin word, no doubt, created by him, God-formed. Just the very word is something to think about. Deiformis. Or maybe a better translation, which I picked up from somebody else, is God-patterned. When somehow the pattern of our life, the pattern of our personality is copied from the transcendental sources. And that, I would say, is probably the best kind of character education, the best kind of development that I can think of. Eckhart's learning and philosophical subtlety were inevitably put in the service of understanding difficult states of mystical consciousness and of matters attendant upon these. A good example is his explanation of the word darkness, and I think this is, to me, this is particularly significant at the present time. I'll tell you after a minute, but it's not really of very great importance, so I'm not exercising my prophetic powers, my well-known prophetic powers, but the word darkness, as it appears in Exodus 20:21. Here is the sentence. Moses went up to the darkness, inside which there was God. I don't think it's quoted very often, but I think its implications in a proper sense are very significant. Eckhart gives several concurrent interpretations of what darkness may mean in connection with the mystical experience of God. These are of considerable interest, I think, in themselves, while they also illustrate Eckhart's great subtlety and spiritual keenness in interpreting such mystical concepts. So this is now a very interesting excerpt that we can take from Eckhart and which is useful to us. Eckhart said that there are 4 kinds of darkness. Number 1, it may be the darkness may signify a troubled condition which compels a human being to seek God's aid. So if I'm in the darkness, I'm stumbling around in intellectual or moral darkness, my need for the divine is obviously increased. Now what we need to do is then to be conscious of that need and to ask for help. But much of the time we just go around, oh, I'm in darkness, I don't know what the heck is going on, and I am miserable. That's the kind of miserable darkness. Incidentally, from another source, and somewhat related to this, is the much abused man and the much abused expression of the dark night of the soul. That comes from the title of one of the treatises of San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, the great friend and disciple of Saint Teresa, of the great Saint Teresa, my favorite saint. And people think that he wrote about depression that sets in the spiritual life. That's not what he wrote at all. That's not what he meant. San Juan de la Cruz meant that when the real he didn't use that term. When the real transformation takes place in the human soul, we are being what Jung would call a real individuation. There is a withdrawal of affect, as we might call it psychologically, from external concrete objects, not only physical ones, but intellectual ones as well, and emotional ones. In other words, in order to get to the center of our being, where the divine spark resides, we have to withdraw from some other things, at least in some ways, and at least temporarily. Why? Because, as you well know, we can't be everywhere at once. So when we are, when you say, this is again the slogans of the modern world. Oh, you have to be involved. You have to improve the world. You have to change the climate. Well, I tell you what, I have studied magic as well, not just St. Thomas. I didn't have as good a teacher as St. Thomas. But let's say one of my advisors along those lines said that anybody who practices magic and who thinks that he can change the weather is not a magician but a fool. Because those are forces that are way beyond our power to influence. Now, why I brought that up, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure I brought it up for some purpose, and therefore you should appreciate it. See, but his saying was that a human being, when he seeks the aid of the transcendental, you might say, as in terms of Carl Jung's psychology, when a human is beginning to utilize the transcendent function, the function of the consciousness which is beyond the four. Beyond earth, water, fire, and air, or beyond sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition, the transcendent function, which I think pretty much corresponds to what in some of the classical spiritual schools was called the nous in Greek. The nous is beyond the psyche, but it's not the pneuma, the spirit yet, but it's the link between the personality, let us say, and that which transcends the personality, and therefore it is transcendental. So I think this is to be considered. I have heard the adage in several languages that man's adversity is God's opportunity. So if you have been experiencing adversity, be happy. No, I mean, it's a jest, when we think, today we think that adversity serves no good purpose at all. When something happens to me that is not pleasant, it's no use. Forget it, maybe not always. Adversity can and does teach us many things. Number one, if we are alert, I think it teaches us that we live in what has even by theology called a fallen world. That earthly life is hard and full of disappointments. This may lead, however, if properly undertaken, to the recognition that this is not our true home, that we may turn to something other in what again the Greeks call a metanoia. Now once again you have to realize this is not world-denying, these world-denying Gnostics, world-hating Gnostics we are called, well, there are things in this world that I hate, but then there are other things in this world that I like. For instance, a good Wiener Schnitzel I like. That's just at the heretic level. But let's say, adversity can and does teach us many things. That needs to be kept in mind. And that earthly life is hard, it's full of disappointments and so forth, but if we take the proper conclusions from these things, then it may lead to what the Greeks called a metanoia, or turning about, which has been very inadequately translated into English as conversion. It just means a turning about. So that needs to be kept in mind. It can happen any time. I would say, I'm not going to be here now and brag to you about my conversion, how I found the light and all of that, and hallelujah, Jesus. No, but let's say, in all of our lives at various times there are moments of insight. And I would say that such a metanoia type of insight that I recollect offhand occurred when I was just 13 years old, and it had a connection with all the terrible things that were going on in the world around me in the middle of the war and of Russian occupation and things of that sort. And it just came to me like thunder that, there must be something better in life than what is going on here. And so maybe there are ways of finding that better. And if I find such a way, but doggone it, I'm going to take advantage of it. And I tried. I mean, I didn't always succeed. No, nobody succeeds always. But these are the kind of things that can happen. Look, I have to find something beyond this. Look, I have to turn somehow my vision, because somewhere there is something better. There is something more meaningful, there is something more transcendental, and something that may help me then to have a life. And it did. So this is the kind of darkness that can be put to good use, because what's darkened, the place of that which is darkened may be taken by something that is much more useful. And then the second darkness that Eckhart speaks about, the darkness may denote the troubled condition of a human being, not when he experiences adversity, but when the God within him is moving. So something else starts, and its presence, as it begins to come forth, darkens the external world. It's almost as if something inside of you says, look, don't look at all that stuff out there, Don't look at the White House, don't look at the election, except from what is absolutely necessary. But you know what? I am here. I am here inside of you. I can come forth. I can show you things that none of these external things can show you. But first you have to stop looking out there. Why? Because we only have two eyes, We can't look in all directions at the same time. I don't know if we were octopuses or whatever they are called, with a lot of eyes, then we could look all over, but we can't. So this is, I think, a very direct, good statement. Meister Eckhart quotes the prayer of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who is another one of my favorite saints. After all, I went to school with the Cistercian order, and Saint Bernard was a fabulous character. I just give you he was traveling in the divine regions practically all the time, but when required, he could come back and say, so, come on, you got to do this, you got to do that. But for instance, he took off from he was the abbot of the great monastery, monastic city of Clairvaux, the early Cistercian order. So he was going someplace. So he got on his horse and he rode. So he rode for a while, and then some of the peasantry around the ranch said, Father, stop. He says, what do you want? Father, you are not sitting on that horse properly. What do you mean? And he found out he was sitting in reverse. He was sitting looking back on the horse. Because he was in ecstasy, he got on the horse, and the horse cooperated, and so there they went. But I guess he changed his position after that. So he was full of things like that. But he was also the tremendous visionary, and in his own way, really, he was one of the probably the greatest apostle of Sophia in Western history. In Eastern history, it's people like Solovyov. But and why was that? Because he was tremendously involved in the wisdom literature of the New Testament, particularly the book of the Wisdom of Solomon and the all the ones about the Queen of Sheba and so forth. And he said, that's the great lady. She's embodied in the Virgin Mary, but he's also embodied in others. This is the wisdom. This is the divine wisdom. You folks ought to recognize that. So he was one of the early contactees, shall we say, without flying saucers, of Sophia. So Eckhart quotes the prayer of Saint Bernard, because that's how I started out with this. This is the prayer, a prayer of Saint Bernard. If thou art with us, grant that I may always be in a troubled condition. This is addressed to God, so that I may always be worthy of having thee with me. In other words, you are my helper, you are my friend, and if it takes being troubled for your presence, then I'll take the trouble. A really beautiful thought. And this is really different from the kind of navel contemplating serenity worship that we get sometimes in so-called spiritual circles. Because serenity can be complacency. If somebody is serene in the face of terrible things, maybe they just don't know what the heck is going on. But it can be complacency. I think that some psychologists coined the term for this, the need for what they call perturbation. In other words, don't be too serene. Don't be too quiet. Maybe you need to be stirred up a bit. Maybe out of that stirring up, something good will come. So don't close yourself off to that sort of thing either. Of course, don't get stirred up to the point that you jump off a cliff. But energy in the psyche, energy in the soul. And it's true. I've been around people, and I certainly don't want to put them down. It's very much in a serene mode, nothing bothers them, nothing should bother you, everything is all there. But it comes out, what the final conclusion when you are in the presence of people is the following. Great disclosure, please listen. They are dull. They are dull. Nothing's going on. And you know what? I don't want to take as my inspiration and my teacher people in whose soul nothing is going on. I'd like to see something going on. Maybe then something will go on in me too. And that was precisely dear old Eckhart's position. He said, serenity can be complacency. And so a perturbation of the spirit is often the hallmark of many mystical and Gnostic states, and it even appears like so many of these things in a very powerful, very complex way in the Gospel of Thomas, which I mentioned before, the second logion, the second saying in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "Let him who seeks not cease seeking until he finds. And when he finds, he will be troubled. And when he has been troubled, he will marvel, and he will reign over the all." So what is described here is a process, not an event. I had a vision of Jesus. I'm saved and sanctified. I am now living in the land of Canaan, eating grapes and pomegranates, and the devil won't tempt me anymore. This is actually a phrase that a good friend of mine heard in an evangelical meeting. And somehow it was so stimulating to me that I remembered it. But anyway, what we are dealing with him is that when one finds, when one really is there with the real things, the sign of that finding can be being troubled, because it's so different from everything else. And things that are different from our accustomed and often beloved routine, they trouble us. So therefore, don't be too troubled if you're troubled, because it might lead to something. But of course, don't just stay with being troubled, because then you are just one of the millions who are routinely troubled. No, these are my words, not of Mestre Eckhart. But I think that when he has been troubled, he will marvel, and he will reign over the all. so that a troubled condition may and perhaps very often leads to the kind of altered state of consciousness which brings marvel. You marvel at the marvelous which is around, and this then places you in a very good position. So I think we have said about the perturbation and so forth, but let us say these two out of the four that we mentioned are probably the most important ones. But let's say another one of Meister Eckhart's statements has to do with how permanence can get away from impermanence. We will discover that impermanence must be beyond this world. That if we are looking for, let's say, the creative movement of transcendence, then we are not looking at a solid block on which we can sit. But there is creative change, there is impermanence. So we should welcome impermanence as long as it leads beyond itself. And this, I think, is very important. Everything that we consider in various ways as being permanent in this world turns out to be impermanent. Mm-hmm. Look at Hitler and his bodies. I remember very well the 1,000-year Reich. How long did it last? About 20 years or so. That was 1,000 years. So you see, we want to fixate. We think we created a condition, and this is the way we want it now. We don't want any change. Money, power, even learning, these things are impermanent. All kinds of things can happen to take them from us. Beauty, I don't need to tell you. I think one of the real reasons, which was not mentioned by Bram Stoker, is why Dracula and why the vampires don't like mirrors. Because their beauty doesn't last. And vampires like to be beautiful, have that nice, smooth, white skin, alabaster skin, which needs to be nourished with blood. But this is just a little foretaste of Halloween, so you don't pay too much. A cognate concept also implicit in many of these, dear to Eckhart, and I certainly cannot conclude without that. Yeah, we're all right. Is his concept of letting be, lassen sein. The human who is submerged in the world, in the mundane life, cannot let things be, but forever tries to alter and manipulate life. In contrast with this, we need to let the world of impermanence be. Okay, sure. I have a tree, and it doesn't get enough water, the tree is dying. Well, once I have tried various things, maybe I've got to let it be. And there's one thing that I certainly know a good deal about now, as the result of time. that one has to let be one's age, you know. If you don't let it be, you become a caricature of yourself and of someone else. But if you let it be and try to manipulate with it in a more or less intelligent way, like, you know, your memory gets disturbed, at least mine does. So what will happen? Well, if you had a pretty good vocabulary to begin with, you think of an alternative concept and an alternative word, and the one that doesn't come to you will come later. Yeah? So there are ways of dealing with this, and this is the letting be. The human who is submerged in the world, says Mestre Eckhart, cannot let things be. He forever tries to alter and manipulate life. Now, in contrast with this, we need to let the world of impermanence be, as I mentioned before. It works in its own way. Let it go on as it must. We are able to, as we are able to do this, we also learn how to let ourselves be, as he put it, God-shaped. Now that's a strange term. What shape is God? Well, he said God-shaped. When we leave ourselves alone, the divine has a chance to shape us and reshape us. So this is perhaps among other things an admonition against morbid introspection, and particularly the more Freudian approaches to psychology, to psychoanalysis and things like that are of that sort. I have met Freudians, both patients and therapists, who it's just always, you know, pickiness with your unconscious. Oh, you're doing this right. You don't do this not right. You are thinking about this badly. You have the wrong kind of dreams. You know, come on, let it be. You know, and the projection of that onto a larger scale are the revolutionary ideologies of a political nature. You know, always, you know, always change. Change. You know, said, you want change? Do you inquire what kind of change you want, or do you just want change? And you know what? If I come down with cancer, there'll be a change. It's not going to be the change that I desire. You know, so be a little bit discriminating about change. Don't get infatuated just with change as such, because that's just an energy. That's nothing. If you are inclined toward change, try to see changes which are beneficial, and which are beneficial spiritually. Change from a heletic to a psychic, and from a psychic to a pneumatic. You know, change to something better. But it's somehow assumed that very often that the change itself, quite aside from its content, is somehow terribly beneficial. That's not true. Listen, if you become deadly sick, that's a change. You were healthy before, you changed into being sick. Was it a good thing? No. And if you want to project this to a larger scale, you know, you lived in a free society, and then it changes to an unfree society. No good, no good. I can assure you, I've been in it. It's really, really bad, you know. So the thing is, change. What kind of change? And it would seem to me that a rational being would think of things that way, but great many of them don't. And one of the reasons I think is that we are easily swept away by energy. We are swept away by psychic energy, even as we are swept away by the wave of an ocean or something. And we've got to watch that, because energy gets hold of your consciousness and carries it. And carries it in all kinds of ways, many of which can be counterproductive. For one thing, ego inflation and all these kinds of things, they're all the result of energy. When an ego, a psychological ego, gets puffed up, the doctor, as Professor Ernest Wood, the dear man, used to say, the doctrine of the bloated ego. So when the ego undergoes bloat, it feels good. It's energizing. And you say, maybe I'm not a dumbbell that I thought I was. Yeah. And yet the fact of the matter is that you are being led into an illusion. And the most illusions are, in fact, I think a good definition, philosophical definition of an illusion is not that it's a falsehood, but that it is something that maybe has a kernel of truth in it that has been inflated out of proportion. So an illusion has some truth in it, but that truth is deceiving you when it masquerades as a great big totality. And so that is where intelligent and honest self-observation is a good idea. I don't mean flagellating yourself. I mean, leave that to others. They'll do it. They'll do it. They'll do it. If you think you need a beating up, you'll find somebody who will do it. Verbally, intellectually, physically, all kinds of ways. Because people like to do that. But on the other hand, you have to be careful not to not to succumb to these energies that inflate the ego in various other ways, and therefore really lead you into directions which are self-defeating. So Meister Eckhart said that we should let be, which might be called a spiritual detachment, but it also has been translated by some from his archaic German, in which he wrote as disinterest. And in my books at home, where I have the collections of Meister Eckhart, there are many of them. He is bitter about the times in which he lives. So if you have, especially now in the wake of all the stuff that we have gone through for the last few years, if you have a certain bitterness, well, you know what? Even Meister Eckhart had some of it. Don't be too hard on yourself. Because in very truth, and he says things like that we really always live in the best of times and in the worst of times, as the poet said. Why? Because in every time there are opportunities for good things. We would say opportunities for gnosis. He would say opportunities of communion with God, for turning to the highest. But at the same time, there are also temptations toward distraction. And the worst temptations toward distraction are the ones that come with a thunderstorm, come with come with a big wind, not actually, but psychologically. You got to watch it. When feelings come to you, desires come to you, preoccupations come to you with an uncommon energy, then it may be time to kind of stop and try to feel that energy and feel it out and see whether that energy is really an unholy energy. I don't mean that devil is there talking to your ear. Yes, there are demons in the cosmos, and they are unpleasant fellows, I declare, but that's something else. But on the whole, these are interior psychological phenomena, and don't get caught up on the energy. That's the great problem. I'm a Hungarian, and they say the Hungarians have a temperament like the flame that comes from straw. When we are ignited, we burn, And we had a lot of occasions in our history to thus burn. But let us say we got to watch it, because these energies can take us in the wrong direction. And so maybe the best thing is to have a little bit of that letting be. Okay, this excites me in a pleasant way or in an unpleasant way. It's of course very much true with anger and so forth. But if we can withdraw affect from it, it's difficult to do, because it's like a storm. It carries you along, You say, oh, come on, maybe I should not flow with this. Don't go with the flow. The good old 60s expression, go with the flow. Don't go with the flow, but maybe let it be. And this is really very similar to some of the admonitions of the Buddha and various other wise people. Saying, take a step back, let it be, and don't get so terribly involved in it. And say the Master Eckhart gets quite bitter about this too. He's bitter about the times he lives in. It seems we always live in, as I said, in the best of times and in the worst of times. So he says to let things be and allow the divine to shape things. That's of course very important. There is something here. You can call it somebody in a monotheistic way if you want to. You can call it a divine energy. You can call it whatever you want to. But there is something here that knows more than I do. As discouraging as that may sound to me, especially when I'm lecturing, but we need to keep that in mind. And if we let our selfhood take a back seat, you don't have to try to do away with it, psychologically speaking, I know that not colloquially speaking, psychologically speaking, if you do away with your ego, as some gurus and so tell you, what would happen? You would be insane. You would be meshuggah, as we call it on Fairfax Avenue, because it's the ego that is the carrier of consciousness. It's just that it should not be allowed to rule the roost. It should be there as a helper, if possible, rather than a hindrance, as it so often is. Eckhart delivered a Christmas sermon, which unfortunately I don't have with me, but sometimes in the future I'll use it, wherein he said, among other things, the knowledge that is in the core of the soul is the knowledge that we should seek. That is the Christ child. the knowledge that is at the core of the soul. Now, what is this if not gnosis? Of course it is. But the names really don't matter. We have to move away from externalities and self, and then we will be, he says, if we move away, this is one of his sayings actually, verbatim, that if we move away from the self, we will be admitted to the truth. How? Well, there is a negative way, and he writes, and a positive way. The negative way, I think, maybe comes first. That is the one that is embodied in the Eastern Hindu saying, neti, neti, not this, not this. In other words, this is not what I'm looking for. This is not what I'm looking for. It's not it. So the way of finding, after we renounce the many things, says Eckhart, as being not it, we looked at this, that's not it. It's not it. There's a good army joke about that, which, however, I'm not going to complicate the ending of the last portion of our talk with it. But by being astute enough to recognize what is not what we need, we may qualify for that which we need. So that's the negative way. So you have to learn how to say no. Oh yeah, you know what? This is nice, but this is not what I want. Okay, adios. Take the night train to the big adios, away, as the movie says. Now, that's not it. The attitude of that's not it precedes the that's it. Then comes the that's it. Then comes the recognition. The latter is what we call maybe the positive way, the way of finding. After we renounce the many things as being not it, we find maybe eventually the one thing, and we can say, yes, that's it. Strive for it. Listen, look, have your nostrils open to smell it, like a horse. And horses you can learn a lot from horses. Unfortunately, I only had my horse until it was taken away from me, but I do remember the strange interaction that occurs after a while between the rider and the horse. So smell it like a horse. It will come. Just be sure to recognize it when it comes. And by the way, when I use the metaphor of the olfactory, I'm also using it in the negative sense. There are bad things. There are misleading things. There are stupid things. There are ridiculous things in this world which smell. And if you learn how to smell them and say, yeah, you know what, I don't like this. Now, it is maybe a psychological phenomenon, but things can translate themselves into a smell. I think I probably still have time for that. The olfactory sense, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is much more important than we think. And there are, for instance, spirit beings, people who died, one thing or the other, who will alert you to their presence by a fragrance and other fragrances. And Madame Blavatsky, there was a play about Madame Blavatsky, and I'll bring that up. And it was a good play. I saw it in some Midwestern city. In any way, she was very, very despondent. She felt that she had failed, and so she sat there. She said, "Well, my master won't have anything to do with me now anymore because I failed on this." And all of a sudden, two things happened. Cling, 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 cling. A little bell started sounding. And then she said, oh, Master, I smell your incense. I smell your incense. You are here. You haven't abandoned me. It was very nicely done. Good acting. And so the order of sanctity, you see. All of these, we have to know how to, if we can, navigate with these. Meister Eckhart says that such a person who has learned to recognize the divine when it's present, when it comes, the real when it comes, such a person in no way can fall into deadly sin, which is, of course, the Catholic theological definition of something really bad, because with the deadly sin, in theological meaning, you cut yourself off to the connection with the divine, for which reason it's considered a highly undesirable condition. So this is rather like the Gnostic teaching that the true pneumatic is really incapable of sin. He's beyond that. And that's another way of putting that. So look at the Cathars, for instance, the medieval Gnostics. God's real noblemen and noble women. No defections, no backsliding, even in the face of torture and death. As one author has said so beautifully, they could do no other. They knew who they were, and they had to act according to who they were. By then there is no other choice. May that condition indeed become more familiar to us. So the losing the ego consciousness are alluded to by some of the statements of Meister Eckhart, but it is a very subtle thing. It is something like in psychology we often call withdrawal of affect. So it's not the thing, boom, I don't have that, but maybe this is something that I should kind of pull back from a little. I wish that that had occurred to me more often in my life. So the same theme is articulated by Eckhart in several sermons. There is the keynote, and he is very forceful, and he's truly magnificent. Is that there is someone. It's perceived, personified, but what's wrong with that? We relate more easily to persons than others. And so let us say the personal aspects of transcendence that may come our way should not be considered lowly, but should be understood in a mystical way. There is someone there who, whether we know it or not, leads us unto himself. Those are actually Eckhart's words. Something draws us on. If we follow, if we don't stand in the way, if we withdraw ourselves from the things into which we have scattered ourselves, that is also an Eckhartian expression, then if we are able to withdraw ourselves into the irrelevancies into which we have dethrone ourselves, then we are moving in the right direction. So the object of wholeness, and he mentions that, is to go to the divine, to God. The human wholeness goes to the greater wholeness. And this, I think, is very, very important. Because we are, one of our fears, and we are an anxious, a fearful race, for a variety of reasons, some of it our history and so forth. We are just a bunch of scared rabbits. But at the same time, we need, one of the things that we are afraid of is that we are going to lose. We are going to lose who we are, that we are going to lose ourselves. We are going to lose what life has constructed for us. Eckhart says, God is not going to take anything from you that belongs to you. He says, what you have is a gift, and God does not take his gifts back. Now, if you are thinking outside of a monotheistic context, well, you can call it whatever you want to call it. But I think that it is true. So the things that are good, we should appreciate. The things that are distract us, we should shun. And if we do that, then we cannot fail but to move in the right direction. We cannot fail. But we have to be careful, and we have to allow those elements of life which should diminish in our life, diminish, and those which need to increase. So it's the two things, the loss and the gain, the black pillar and the white pillar of the Kabbalah, and we have to navigate between these. And if we do that, then ultimately we really cannot go wrong, because the desire, the passion, the longing, the unquenchable thirst that is within us is the thirst for the divine, for transcendence. We will never be happy, we will never be satisfied, we will never be healthy in soul or body until we follow that. And if we follow that, then we cannot go wrong. I know it's difficult. All humans have difficulty with it. We are distracted by all manner of things constantly. But somehow, in the back of it all, in the back of the great screen of life, there is a drum. Drum, drum, drum. And you know what it drums? It drums. God, God, God. Divine, divine, divine. That is what you need. That is what you want. And with grace and your perseverance, that is what you shall achieve. And we need to give thanks for probably the greatest and the most honest of the great mystics of the past, Mestre Eckhart, for having so efficiently tried to convey this to us. And I'm so happy that we were able to touch it just a little. There are some very good selections, very good books of his works that we may profit from. But for anyway, thanks to Eckhart and to his kin, who have called our attention to these things, because if it weren't for them, we might be lost. I don't mean we're going to be in hell, but we will not be where we should be. And we must be where we should be, which is on the way to transcendence, on the way to the divine, onto the way of real divine meaning. And if we recognize that and if we keep that in mind, then we cannot go wrong. And let's hope that we have been led a little bit closer to that tonight. If so, then my efforts will not have been in vain. I thank you very much.